All right, lecture number 9 for Unit 1 Endocrine System. We're going to talk about thyroid hormones. So we've heard a little bit about this already because in the last lecture we talked about how the hypothalamus produces thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, that travels to the anterior pituitary. It signals the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. That travels to the blood through the bloodstream, and its target is most of the cells that are located in the thyroid gland, the ones that make your thyroid hormones. All right, and so over on the anatomy side, you should be learning about the thyroid gland, where it's located. It's anterior to the trachea, has a butterfly type shape. And then I'm also highlighting over there for you that if you zoom in on the thyroid at a microscopic level, like if you were looking at little two-dimensional slices through the thyroid, like you see over here, the thyroid is really made up of a bunch of spherical, kind of roughly spherical shaped structures called follicles. And inside those follicles, you have a jelly-like substance called colloid. Come on, stylus. Ugh. Colloid. That's what you see here in pink. That is like a jelly. That is a not. It's not like. It is a jelly-like substance where thyroid hormones are stored until they need to be released into the bloodstream to help control metabolism. So you're hearing that over on the anatomy side. And then if you think, now in this diagram, what you are seeing is, imagine you've got these three-dimensional little spheres here, or follicles, and they've been cut open, and you're seeing them as a 2D, two-dimensional slice through those follicles. Then what you're going to see is a bunch of circles and ovals and so forth, basically. And right here along the edges of those follicles, okay, you have cells there, and those cells are called follicular cells. Okay, so if you think about a follicle being like a basketball, the follicular cells would be the surface of the follicle, and then the colloid would fill up the inside of the follicle. All right, and then also on this diagram, let me erase all of that. Now, wherever you see these purple spots on a tissue section like this, if you didn't talk about this in Biology 201, each of those is a nucleus of a cell. You can't really see the cytoplasm surrounding the cell too well, but everywhere you see a purple dot, that represents the nucleus of a cell. So you have other cells within the thyroid as well. They're in between the follicles. Like if you got a follicle here, and here's a follicle over here, you have some cells in between, and those are called parafollicular. Para, that prefix usually means that something is next to something else, or kind of running alongside it. And parafollicular cells are the ones that make calcitonin, if you remember talking a little bit about that over in Biology 201. The follicular cells are the ones that we're mainly going to be talking about here, because they make your thyroxins, or T3 and T4. These are your thyroid hormones, the main ones that we think about when we're talking about the thyroid. Okay. Now, one of the things that we're going to see here is that the follicle, so I said they have a jelly-like substance on the inside, and that's referred to as colloid. And colloid is kind of like Jell-O, has a lot of water in it, but then it also has a lot of this glycoprotein. That's a sugar protein. That's a molecule that is a combination between a protein, and it has sugars attached to it. There's one called thyroglobulin. Your follicular cells make thyroglobulin. That is a glycoprotein, and that is stored inside those follicles, inside that colloid jelly-like substance. You also have iodine in there. Maybe you've heard that before. The thyroid takes up iodine. It's why we have to have iodine in our diets. And inside that colloid, you have a precursor of the thyroid hormones. So that means an immature form. It hasn't completely matured all the way yet. And then, as I mentioned, those parafollicular cells that you have in between the follicles, those produce calcitonin that you heard a little bit about when you took Biology 201. So you have different cells in the thyroid that make different hormones, kind of like what you had going on with the anterior pituitary and with the hypothalamus as well. All right, so what are these thyroid hormones? Sometimes abbreviated as TH. There actually are two versions of this. So there's a version called T4, which is also known as thyroxine, and it has two tyrosine molecules. Tyrosine is a type of amino acid. So your cells generally use 20 different kinds of amino acids to build proteins. So they get linked together in different orders, different sequences to build different proteins. All right, sorry about that. My phone here in my office started ringing. All right, so T4 has two of those tyrosine amino acids. They're bonded together, and then they're also attached to 4 iodine atoms. And those things combined together, bonded together, form tetraiodothyronine. That's the long name, abbreviated as T4. So that's one version of a thyroid hormone. T3 is the other version. T3 stands for triiodothyronine. And so this version has 2 tyrosines, but only 3 iodines. So there are 2 different versions of this that exist in the body. T4 and T3 affect virtually every single cell in the body. They control metabolism, and since all of your cells have to metabolize, that's not a big surprise. All right, so what these hormones do, they increase your metabolic rate. More specifically, they increase cellular respiration. All right, so you're going to break down nutrients faster. You're going to increase your ATP production. So all of those things you associate with cellular respiration are going to happen faster when thyroid hormones are produced at higher levels. Okay, another thing, if you guys remember from when you learned a little bit about cellular respiration in Biology 201, one of the byproducts of cellular respiration is heat. As you break down nutrients, it's just like when you break down gasoline molecules in the engine of your car, heat gets released. So some of that stored energy gets converted over to heat. So heat production, more thyroid hormone production, you have more heat production, and that is sometimes referred to as a calorogenic or calorogenic effect. Thyroid hormones, because they control metabolism, they're going to be involved with growth and development. That makes sense. If you're growing, you're developing as an embryo, a fetus, a child. Metabolism, you've got to break down nutrients to release the energy and make the ATP that's needed to power those types of things. So it makes sense, of course, that the thyroid hormones are going to be involved in that as well. Also involved in maintaining your blood pressure, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. All right, this is a diagram from your textbook which is providing some of the gory details for how T3 and T4 wind up getting produced. And so what you're looking at here, all right, so over here you've got a follicle, one of these spheres that make up the thyroid gland, and those are surrounded by microscopic blood vessels or capillaries. That's what they're showing you over here. All right, and then here we're zooming in on a follicular cell. So that's one of these cells here that lines the surface of a follicle. And all right, so cells make proteins. We said thyroglobulin is a glycoprotein. It's a protein with sugars attached. So thyroglobulin, you see there, gets made in these follicular cells, and then it winds up getting secreted in here. It goes inside the follicle. All right, and then the glycoproteins absorb water, and that glycoprotein-water combination is what gives you this sticky jelly-like consistency you have inside those follicles. All right, and so then what happens as well, iodine or iodide is an iodine atom with a negative charge. That's how iodine is dissolved in your body fluids when you take it in from the foods that you eat or iodized salt. This is why we have iodine in the salt that we buy in the grocery store, is to support production of our thyroid hormones. Very, very important. So these iodine ions are also taken up by these follicular cells, and then they're transported, and they're also sent inside the follicles into that colloid. And then those iodines, what happens is they are attached to the thyroglobulin glycoproteins. All right, so we said that T3 and T4 are actually tyrosine molecules that are complexed with iodine. Well, tyrosine is a type of amino acid, and what are proteins? They're chains of amino acids. Tyrosine is a type of amino acid. So you have tyrosines within the thyroglobulins. They're part of the chain in there, and the iodines get attached to them. Okay? And then what happens is, so we said T3 and T4, you got two tyrosines plus these iodines complex together. So all those things get bonded together while they're still part of the thyroglobulin. So they haven't been chopped out yet. They're still part of that sequence of amino acids in the thyroglobulin. All right, then as needed, when you need to increase the levels of T3 and T4 in your bloodstream and body fluids, these thyroglobulins get taken back up inside the follicular cells, and the T3 and the T4s get cleaved out. So the two tyrosines plus the iodines that have been bonded there get clipped out of the chain of amino acids that makes up the thyroglobulin, and then those get released out of the follicular cells. They very quickly diffuse into these capillaries, and now they're in the blood, so they're going to travel throughout the body. So that's just a little bit about how T3 and T4 are actually made. One of the key things to remember here is T3 and T4 are so critical that you need them in, when you need to increase their levels, you need to increase their levels right away. So the thyroid actually has to store these inside those follicles in the thyroid so that you can very quickly take those thyroglobulins back into the follicular cells and clip out those T3s and T4s and stick them into the bloodstream very quickly when you need them. So keep that in mind. Think about the thyroid as storing these T3s and T4s inside that colloid, and then the colloid is made up of that thyroglobulin plus water plus the iodine that has been brought in there. All right, so that slide just kind of outlines what I mentioned for you, how those thyroid hormones are made. Now, once T4 and T3 have been clipped out of the thyroglobulin and they get released into the bloodstream, these are actually hydrophobic, so they don't like water. And you may remember earlier I mentioned when you have these hydrophobic molecules, they don't dissolve in your body fluids because they hate water. So there are certain proteins that transport T4 and T3 around in your bloodstream, so it can, and that's how they get delivered to the various cells in the body. All right, so T4 and T3 also, if you guys remember, hydrophobic type hormones can diffuse into your cells. They go inside your cells, and then their receptors are actually inside the cells. Okay, so T3 and T4 can both bind their receptors that are inside the cells, but T3 is 10 times more active than T4. So it's 10 times as potent. It's 10 times as likely to stick to its receptor and trigger an effect. So because of that, your tissues actually tend to convert T4 over to T3. So that little extra iodine gets clipped out or clipped off so that T4 becomes T3, and now that T3 is going to be 10 times more potent than it was before. All right, so that's an introduction to T3 and T4, these important thyroid hormones. And the next video, I'm actually going to divide this into 2 video lectures, so it's not quite as long as the anterior pituitary lecture was. And next lecture, we'll talk about thyroid hormone regulation and some disorders. Some of the thyroid disorders are very interesting, so we'll cover those in the next video lecture.